In the dead of night, when shadows creep through silent streets, not every hero is ready for what's about to come. Some moments are born of fear, others of courage. But sometimes, a single choice is all that stands between life and devastation. They say it takes just a spark to ignite a fire. But what happens when that fire comes for you? When the walls you thought were safe become an inferno, and the air you breathe turns to smoke? Most people run, but not her. It all started with a scream, just a faint cry that pierced the stillness, cutting through the hum of distant traffic and the rustling of leaves in the wind. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you feel like you're the only one awake, alone with your thoughts. But that night, something was different. The air felt heavier, thick with a sense of unease. A dog barked in the distance, then fell silent, as if even the animals sensed that something was wrong. And then, the smell. The sharp, acrid scent of burning wood, so faint at first that you could almost mistake it for a neighbor's fireplace. But then it grew stronger, more intense, filling the air with a stinging bitterness that clawed at the back of the throat. Smoke, dark and sinister, began to curl through the cracks of windows, creeping like a shadow into places it didn't belong. In one small house, Layla sat hunched over a textbook, trying to drown out the world with the pages of a borrowed dream. She was focused on her studies, scribbling notes under the dim glow of a desk lamp. When the scent reached her, she froze, her pencil hovering in midair, her mind struggling to place the unfamiliar smell. And then she saw it, out of the corner of her eye, through the narrow crack of her window, a glow, orange and flickering, like the breath of some ancient beast. Her heart pounded in her chest as she moved to the window, drawing back the curtain with trembling fingers. Outside, the darkness was broken by a harsh, pulsing light. Flames, reaching out hungrily from the house down the street, Mr. Roberts' house. The quiet old man who lived alone, whose porch light always flickered like a heartbeat in the night. Now, that light was swallowed by a blaze that cast eerie shadows against the walls. Layla's breath caught in her throat. She fumbled for her phone, dialing 911 with shaking hands, her voice barely steady as she spoke to the operator. The calm, detached response did little to soothe her racing thoughts. "Help is on the way," the operator assured her. But even as the words reached her, she knew the truth. Help wouldn't be there in time. The fire was spreading too fast, devouring everything in its path with terrifying speed. And Mr. Roberts, he could still be inside. Panic clawed at her, a voice in her mind screaming for her to stay put, to wait for the professionals. But then another image flashed before her eyes. Mr. Roberts struggling to lift his groceries, the way he always smiled at her when she offered to help. His quiet kindness, the gentle encouragement he offered whenever she spoke about her dreams of becoming a doctor. And in that instant, she knew she couldn't just stand by. Without thinking, she bolted for the door, the night air hitting her like a slap to the face as she raced down the street. Her feet pounded against the cracked pavement. The distance between her home and Mr. Roberts is shrinking with every frantic step. Around her, lights began to flick on in neighboring houses, confused faces appearing in windows, but she didn't stop to explain. She couldn't afford to. Her mind was focused on one thing, and one thing only, getting to Mr. Roberts before it was too late. As she reached the front porch, the heat hit her like a wave, searing and intense. The flames danced wildly, throwing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. Layla hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. This was her last chance to turn back, to let the professionals handle it. But then she heard it, a muffled sound from inside, weak but unmistakable. A cough, a plea for help, swallowed by the roar of the fire. She took a deep breath, her lungs burning with the smoke that had already begun to fill the air, and pushed the door open. What met her inside was chaos. A wall of thick, black smoke engulfed her, blinding her as she dropped to her knees, remembering the fire drills from school. She crawled along the floor, her fingers brushing against the familiar layout of Mr. Roberts' home, now transformed into a deadly maze. The heat pressed down on her, forcing sweat to bead on her skin as she called out into the darkness. "Mr. Roberts, it's Layla. I'm here." Her voice barely carried over the crackling flames, but she pushed forward, driven by a desperate need to find him. She navigated through the living room, feeling the heat grow more intense, the air growing thinner. A section of the ceiling collapsed behind her with a deafening crash, sending a shower of embers across the room. Layla flinched but kept moving, inching her way toward the kitchen, where she had last seen Mr. Roberts on those quiet afternoons when she helped him carry his bags. And then, through the haze of smoke, she saw him, huddled in the corner, his face streaked with soot, his breathing labored. He looked up as she approached, his eyes widening with a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Layla, what are you doing here?" he wheezed, his voice barely a whisper. She reached out, grabbing his arm, her grip firm despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. "We have to go, Mr. Roberts. Now," he nodded, struggling to stand as she helped him to his feet, supporting his weight as they stumbled back toward the door. The journey back through the burning house felt like an eternity. Layla's lungs screamed for clean air, her vision blurred by the smoke that filled every corner. But she refused to let go of Mr. Roberts, refused to let herself think about what might happen if they didn't make it out in time. Her mind was fixed on one thing, getting to the front door, to the safety of the cool night air beyond. And just when it seemed like they might not make it, a gust of fresh air hit her face, like a lifeline pulling her back from the edge. They burst through the front door, collapsing onto the lawn as firefighters rushed past them, their shouts barely registering in her ears. Layla gasped for air, her body shaking with exhaustion, her hands still clutching Mr. Roberts' arm. For a moment, the world was nothing but noise and confusion. The wail of sirens, the hiss of water hitting flames, the murmur of voices around her. But then, as she looked over at Mr. Roberts, she saw something that made her forget all of it. Gratitude in his eyes, shining through the soot and tears. In that moment, she knew she had made the right choice, that whatever the consequences might be, she had done what she had to do. But what Layla didn't know was that sometimes the fire isn't the most dangerous thing waiting in the dark. Sometimes the real test comes after the flames go out, when the smoke clears and the truth comes to light. In the days that followed, she would learn that saving a life doesn't always mean you get to live yours the way you planned. And the man she saved had secrets that would change everything she thought she knew. Layla sat on the edge of the ambulance's open door, a wool blanket draped around her shoulders, the rough fabric scratching against her skin. Her breathing still came in ragged gasps, the smoke lingering in her lungs. Across from her, Mr. Roberts was lying on a stretcher, an oxygen mask pressed to his face. He seemed frail and shaken, but there was a spark of life in his eyes that hadn't been there just minutes before. Layla's thoughts swirled with the chaos of what had just happened. She had acted without thinking, driven by a need she couldn't quite name. And now, staring at the aftermath of the fire, it all felt surreal. The neighborhood was abuzz with activity. Flashing lights painted the charred remains of Mr. Roberts' home in stark reds and blues, the silhouettes of firefighters moving like shadows as they worked to douse the last stubborn embers. Neighbors huddled together, their faces ghostly pale in the harsh lights, whispering among themselves. Layla could hear snippets of their conversations. Words like hero and miracle drifted through the air, making her shift uncomfortably on the cold metal step. "You okay, kid?" a paramedic asked, his voice gruff but kind, as he leaned over to check her pulse. Layla nodded, her throat still raw from the smoke.
"Yeah, I'm okay,"
she managed to croak out, her voice barely audible. The paramedic offered her a small smile before moving on to check on Mr. Roberts again. Layla turned her gaze back to the ruined house, feeling a pang of sadness for all that had been lost. The fire had torn through the place so quickly, devouring everything in its path. But at least they had made it out. At least Mr. Roberts was alive. A police officer approached Layla, his notepad in hand and a concerned expression on his face. He crouched down to her eye level, his voice gentle despite the urgency of the situation. "Can you tell me what happened tonight?" he asked. Layla took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts as she recounted the events of the last hour. She spoke of the smoke, the flames, and the frantic decision to run into the burning house. As she spoke, a small crowd gathered around her, listening intently. She could see their faces, neighbors she had known all her life, looking at her with a mix of awe and disbelief. Among the onlookers, Layla spotted Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who lived next door. Mrs. Thompson's eyes were wide with emotion, her hand pressed to her mouth as she listened. "You're a hero, Layla," she called out, her voice cracking with gratitude. Others in the crowd murmured their agreement, nodding along. Layla felt heat rise to her cheeks, a blush that had nothing to do with the fire's warmth. She wasn't used to this kind of attention.
"I just did what anyone would do,"
Layla said softly, glancing down at her soot-covered hands. But deep down, she knew that wasn't entirely true. Not everyone would have risked their life to save another. But she couldn't find the right words to explain what had driven her to act. It had been instinct, a moment where fear had given way to something stronger. As the night wore on, the chaos began to settle. The fire was finally under control, reduced to smoldering embers, and the crowd started to disperse. Layla's mother arrived soon after, rushing toward her daughter with a look of sheer panic in her eyes. "Layla!" she cried, wrapping her arms around her in a tight embrace. Tears streamed down her mother's face, a mixture of relief and anger. "What were you thinking? You could have been killed." Layla held onto her mother, feeling the familiar warmth and the slight tremor in her mother's hands.
I'm sorry, Mom.
She whispered, her voice breaking.
I couldn't leave him in there.
Her mother's grip tightened, then loosened as she pulled back to look at Layla, her expression softening with a blend of pride and exasperation. "You did a brave thing tonight," her mother said, brushing a strand of hair from Layla's face. "But you scared me half to death, you know that?" Layla nodded, the weight of her mother's words settling over her. It was only now, with the immediate danger behind them, that she realized just how close she had come to losing everything. She shivered beneath the blanket, the adrenaline fading and leaving behind a deep exhaustion that seeped into her bones. As dawn began to break, Layla found herself sitting on her front porch, wrapped in a fresh blanket and holding a cup of tea that Mrs. Thompson had brought over. The first rays of sunlight peeked over the horizon, casting long shadows across the street. The smell of smoke still lingered in the air, a grim reminder of the night's events, but the worst was over. Mr. Roberts had been taken to the hospital for observation, but the paramedics assured her that he would be okay. Layla stared at the charred remains of his house, feeling a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a twinge of something she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just about the fire, it was about everything that came after. She wondered what her mother would say when the adrenaline wore off, when the reality of what had happened truly sank in. Would she be proud of Layla's bravery, or would she scold her for taking such a risk? Layla couldn't be sure. The quiet of the early morning wrapped around her like a blanket, and for a moment, Layla allowed herself to close her eyes. The weight of the night pressed down on her, and she felt small and fragile beneath it. But even in the uncertainty, there was a strange sense of peace. She had done what she felt was right, even if it had terrified her. She had saved a life. Across the street, firefighters were finishing their final checks, making sure no hidden embers remained. One of them caught Layla's eye and gave her a nod, a gesture of respect that made her heart swell. She returned the nod, feeling a quiet sense of pride settle in her chest. Mrs. Thompson joined her on the porch, sitting beside her with a sigh. "You did good, Layla," she said, her voice soft and warm. "Not everyone would have had the courage to do what you did." Layla glanced at her, then back at the wreckage of Mr. Roberts' home. She wondered if she would ever see him again, if they would be able to speak about what happened without the shadow of the fire hanging over them.
I just hope he's okay.
Layla replied, her fingers tightening around the warm ceramic mug in her hands.
I couldn't imagine losing him like that.
Mrs. Thompson patted her shoulder gently, her touch comforting. "You gave him a second chance, dear, and I think that means more than you know." Layla managed a small smile, the weight on her chest lifting just a little. Maybe Mrs. Thompson was right. Maybe, in a strange way, she had been given a chance too. A chance to see herself in a new light, to understand what she was capable of when pushed to the edge. But she couldn't know then how that night would set into motion a chain of events that would change her life forever. For now, she simply watched as the sun rose over the neighborhood, turning the sky a brilliant shade of gold, and let the warmth seep into her tired body. A few days had passed since that fateful night, and life in the neighborhood began to return to its familiar rhythms. The smell of smoke no longer lingered in the air, and the charred remains of Mr. Roberts' house stood like a dark monument to a night no one would soon forget. Layla tried to settle back into her routine, but she found it difficult. Everywhere she went, she felt the eyes of her neighbors on her, heard their hushed conversations about her bravery. She appreciated their kind words, but they made her feel exposed, like she was standing under a spotlight she never asked for. Layla spent her free time helping her younger siblings with their homework, trying to lose herself in the everyday tasks that usually grounded her. Yet, every so often, she would catch herself staring out the window at the ruins of Mr. Roberts' house, wondering how he was doing. The last she had heard, he was recovering well at the hospital. She hoped he would be able to find a new place to live, but a part of her worried about him being alone again after everything he had been through. Early one morning, before the sun had fully risen, a knock at the door shattered the quiet of Layla's home. She froze, midway through pouring cereal into bowls for her siblings. Her mother, looking as surprised as Layla felt, went to answer the door, her robe wrapped tightly around her. Layla followed, curious but wary, and when the door swung open, she could hardly believe what she saw. Mr. Roberts stood on their doorstep, looking far healthier than he had the last time she saw him. His face was still a little pale, but there was a warmth in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Beside him stood two men in suits, their expressions serious, carrying leather briefcases that looked strangely out of place on the worn front porch of Layla's home. "Mr. Roberts," Layla's mother said, her voice thick with surprise. "Please, come in. You shouldn't be out and about just yet." Mr. Roberts waved a hand dismissively, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips.
"Don't worry. I'm tougher than I look,"
he said, his voice carrying a lightness that seemed to ease some of the tension in the air. Layla's mother stepped aside, gesturing for them to come in, and they all moved into the modest living room, where the air felt thick with anticipation. Layla sat on the edge of the sofa, trying to make sense of the scene unfolding before her. Her mother took a seat beside her, casting concerned glances at Mr. Roberts and his companions. The men in suits introduced themselves as legal representatives, but their formal manner did little to ease Layla's unease. Why would Mr. Roberts bring lawyers to their house? Once everyone was seated, Mr. Roberts turned to Layla, his gaze softening.
"Layla, I don't think I've had the chance to properly thank you for what you did for me that night,"
he began, his voice wavering slightly with emotion.
"You saved my life, and that's something I can never repay, but I'd like to try."
Layla opened her mouth to protest, to tell him that no thanks were needed, that she was just relieved he was okay. But before she could speak, Mr. Roberts raised a hand, his expression turning serious.
"I know you probably think you don't deserve any special recognition, but you do. And there's something you should know about me, something that might come as a surprise."
He paused, glancing at the two men beside him, then back at Layla and her mother.
"I'm not just an old man who kept to himself all these years,"
he said, his voice carrying a weight that made Layla lean in closer.
"Before I retired, I built and sold a successful business. It was worth more money than I knew what to do with.
I moved back here to live a quieter life, to return to the town I grew up in. But after the fire, after what you did for me, I realized it's time for me to make a change." Layla's mind struggled to keep up with what he was saying. Mr. Roberts, a wealthy businessman? She tried to reconcile the image of the quiet, reserved neighbor she had known with the person now sitting before her. Speaking of fortunes she could hardly imagine, it all felt too surreal, like she had stumbled into someone else's story. Mr. Roberts's gaze grew more intense, his expression softening as he addressed Layla directly.
"You've got a lot of potential, Layla. I can see that. And I want to help you reach your dreams. I've spoken with my lawyers here. And I'd like to set up a trust fund or a full scholarship for you to attend any university you choose."
You shouldn't have to worry about money when you're working so hard to build a future. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Layla stared at him, her mouth slightly open, struggling to process the enormity of what he was offering. A trust fund? A scholarship? It was like something out of a storybook, the kind of opportunity she had only ever dreamed of, but never thought would be within her reach. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, her plans to become a doctor, the financial burdens that had always seemed so insurmountable, and the quiet sacrifices she made every day for her family. Her mother's hand found hers, squeezing tightly, bringing her back to the present. Layla glanced at her, seeing the tears welling in her mother's eyes, a mixture of pride and disbelief.
Mr. Roberts, that's incredibly generous, but I don't know if we can accept something like that.
Her mother said, her voice thick with emotion. Layla's always been independent. She's always wanted to earn her way. Mr. Roberts nodded, a knowing smile playing at his lips.
"I understand that. I admire it, truly. But Layla's already earned this many times over. She risked her life to save mine, and that's not something I can ignore."
Please, let me do this for her. Let me give her the chance she deserves. Layla's heart pounded in her chest as she listened, the room spinning around her. She thought about everything she had worked for, the late nights spent studying by the dim glow of a desk lamp, the quiet hope she harbored for a future that felt impossibly distant. This offer, this chance, could it really be hers? And what would it mean for her family, for the life she had built in this neighborhood? Her mother turned to her, searching Layla's face with eyes that held a million unspoken questions. Layla swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their shared history, the years of struggle and sacrifice that had shaped their lives. But beyond that, she saw the possibility of something new, a chance to break free from the limitations that had always seemed so unyielding. Tears welled up in Layla's eyes as she looked back at Mr. Roberts, the sincerity in his gaze cutting through her doubts.
I don't know what to say, Mr. Roberts.
She whispered, her voice barely audible.
This is more than I ever imagined. But if you really want to do this, thank you. Thank you so much.
Mr. Roberts's face lit up with a broad smile, relief washing over him.
No need to thank me, Layla. You've already done more than enough. Consider this my way of saying that heroes deserve a little help, too.
The lawyer, who had been sitting quietly until now, cleared his throat, opening one of the briefcases and pulling out a stack of papers. We'll take care of all the legal aspects, he said, offering a reassuring nod. We want to ensure everything is done properly and transparently, so there's no confusion down the line. Layla nodded numbly, her mind still reeling from the sudden turn of events. As they began discussing the practicalities of the arrangement, she felt a strange sense of clarity settle over her. This opportunity might change her life, but it wouldn't change who she was. She would still be Layla, the girl who dreamed of becoming a doctor, who believed in the power of small kindnesses, who knew that helping others was worth any risk. Outside the window, the sun was rising higher, bathing the neighborhood in golden light. And as Layla looked out at the familiar streets, she felt a surge of hope she hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new, a future where she could give back even more than she had ever imagined. The days that followed Mr. Roberts' visit were a blur for Layla and her family, filled with meetings, paperwork, and the kind of conversations they had never imagined having. Layla found herself sitting across from lawyers, discussing trust funds and scholarship agreements, trying to keep up with words that seemed foreign to her. The numbers they talked about were staggering, far beyond anything she had ever dreamed of. It was as if the world had suddenly tilted on its axis, and she was struggling to find her balance in this new reality. But behind the excitement and hope, Layla couldn't shake the nagging doubts that lingered in the back of her mind. As she sat in the quiet moments between meetings, she wondered if she truly deserved all of this. It felt too big, too generous, like she was stepping into a role meant for someone else. She had always prided herself on working hard, or on earning everything she had. Accepting this gift felt like taking a shortcut, like she was letting herself be swept along by a current that she hadn't chosen. One evening, after yet another meeting with Mr. Roberts and his lawyers, Layla retreated to her room, closing the door softly behind her. Her mother was busy cooking dinner in the kitchen, and the sound of her younger siblings playing in the next room filtered through the walls. Layla sat on the edge of her bed, her textbooks spread out before her, but she couldn't focus. Her thoughts kept returning to the offer, to the weight of the choice she had made. She picked up a photo frame from her bedside table, one that held a picture of her family from years ago. In it, she was just a little girl, her arms wrapped around her younger brother and sister, her mother standing behind them with a tired but proud smile. They were in front of their old apartment, the one they had lived in before moving to this neighborhood. Layla remembered how her mother had worked double shifts to keep them afloat, how they had scraped together every penny to make sure there was enough food on the table. Those memories were a part of her, woven into the fabric of who she was. Layla's mother knocked softly on the door, pushing it open a crack. "Hey, sweetie, can I come in?" she asked, her voice gentle. Layla nodded, setting the photo back on the table as her mother entered the room. She sat beside Layla on the bed, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes searching her daughter's face. "You've been awfully quiet these past few days," her mother said, her tone a mixture of concern and tenderness. "I know this is a lot to take in. If you need to talk about it, I'm here." Layla bit her lip, feeling the familiar sting of tears in her eyes. She had always been strong, the one who kept things together, but now she felt like she was falling apart at the seams.
Mom, do you think I'm making the right decision?
She asked, her voice barely above a whisper.
This scholarship, everything Mr. Roberts is offering, it feels like too much. I didn't do anything special. I just acted without thinking. What if I'm not ready for all this?
Her mother reached out, gently brushing a tear from Layla's cheek. "Oh, Layla," she said softly, her eyes shining with emotion. "You've always been too hard on yourself. You've spent your whole life putting others first, doing whatever you could to make sure your brother and sister had a chance. You worked so hard, even when things were tough. And now, someone wants to help you reach your dreams. There's nothing wrong with accepting that help." Layla stared at her mother, her heart aching with the weight of those words. She had always tried to be strong for her family, to be the one they could rely on, but she had never imagined that she would be the one receiving this kind of support. that her own dreams might come within reach.
I don't want to disappoint anyone.
She whispered, her voice cracking with the depth of her fear.
What if I can't live up to everyone's expectations? What if I fail?
Her mother smiled, the kind of smile that held years of wisdom and love. You could never disappoint me, Layla. Not ever. I'm proud of you no matter what happens. And I know Mr. Roberts wouldn't be offering you this chance if he didn't believe in you too. She paused, taking Layla's hand in hers, squeezing it gently. You've always been strong, but it's okay to lean on others sometimes. You don't have to carry the world on your shoulders. Layla let out a shaky breath, leaning into her mother's embrace, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, she could do this. That accepting help didn't make her weak, and that her worth wasn't defined by how much she could carry alone. The next morning, Layla woke up with a new sense of determination. She had a chance to change her life, to pursue the dreams she had tucked away for so long, and she was determined not to waste it. She threw herself into her studies with a renewed vigor, signing up for advanced classes and seeking out extra tutoring to prepare for college entrance exams. She spent hours at the library, poring over textbooks and practice tests, her mind buzzing with the possibilities that lay ahead. At school, her teachers noticed the change in her, praising her dedication and encouraging her to aim high in her college applications. Layla soaked up their words, feeling a spark of hope reignite inside her. She still had doubts, still wrestled with the fear that she might not be good enough, but she was learning to push past those doubts, to focus on the future she wanted to build. At home, her family began to adjust to the new reality as well. With the promise of the scholarship and trust fund, Layla's mother was able to cut back on her night shifts, spending more time with Layla and her siblings. The constant stress of making ends meet began to ease, replaced by a cautious optimism that settled over their small home. They began talking about the future in a way they hadn't dared to before, about college, about dreams that had once seemed out of reach. Mr. Roberts became a frequent visitor to their home, offering guidance and support as Layla navigated her new world. He shared stories of his own journey, from humble beginnings to success, emphasizing the importance of hard work, resilience, and never forgetting where you came from. Layla listened intently, soaking up every bit of wisdom he offered, finding comfort in his steady presence. One afternoon, as they sat together on the porch, Layla turned to Mr. Roberts, a question that had been nagging at her finally finding its way to the surface.
Why me?
She asked, her voice quiet but earnest.
Why did you choose to help me of all people?
Mr. Roberts looked out at the street, his expression thoughtful.
You remind me of someone I used to know.
He said, his voice tinged with nostalgia.
Someone who worked hard, who never gave up, even when the odds were against him.
I've made my share of mistakes in life, Layla, but I've learned that the best way to make up for them is to pay it forward, to help others find the opportunities that were given to me. He turned to her, his gaze steady and kind. You've got a fire in you, Layla, a drive to make things better, not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. That's rare, and it's worth nurturing. I see a lot of myself in you, and I believe you can go far if you're given the chance. Layla felt a lump form in her throat, his words settling deep into her heart. For the first time, she began to see herself the way others saw her, not just as a girl who had done a brave thing, but as someone with the potential to make a real difference. It was a heavy realization, but it filled her with a newfound resolve. As the sun set behind the houses, casting long shadows across the neighborhood, Layla looked out at the street where she had grown up, the place that had shaped her. She knew that her journey was just beginning, that the road ahead would be long and uncertain. But for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that she was ready for whatever came next. As the weeks turned into months, Layla's life continued to transform in ways she had never imagined. The scholarship and trust fund from Mr. Roberts opened doors that once seemed forever closed, and with each passing day, the future that had once felt so distant came into clearer focus. Layla threw herself into her studies with an intensity that surprised even her teachers. She enrolled in advanced placement classes and sought out extra tutoring, determined to prepare herself for college entrance exams and the challenges that lay ahead. Her days became a blur of activity, filled with study sessions at the local library, where she spent long hours poring over textbooks and practice tests. She worked through equations, memorized vocabulary lists, and filled notebook after notebook with her meticulous notes. It was hard work, but it was the kind of work she had always dreamed of, the kind that promised a future beyond the narrow limits of her small neighborhood. Layla's family adjusted to their new reality as well. The constant worry about bills and groceries, which had once weighed down every conversation, began to ease. With the trust fund taking care of Layla's education, her mother was able to cut back on her night shifts at the factory, spending more time at home with Layla and her younger siblings, Jaden and Mia. Layla saw the change in her mother's face, the lines of exhaustion that had been etched there for years, softening as the stress slowly melted away. For the first time in as long as she could remember, they were able to sit down together for dinner without her mother having to rush off to work. They laughed over simple meals, shared stories about their days, and talked about the future with a hope that had been missing for far too long. Layla noticed how much happier Jaden and Mia seemed, how they clung to every moment with their mother, eager for her attention and praise. It was a kind of peace that Layla hadn't realized how much she missed until she had it again. One afternoon, as Layla was walking home from school, she noticed something different about the empty lot where Mr. Roberts' house had once stood. She had avoided looking at the charred remains of the old house, but today there was something new there. Signs of construction, and a large banner stretched across the front gate that read, "Future Site of the Roberts Community Center." Layla stopped in her tracks, her heart skipping a beat as she took in the site. Workers were busy clearing away the last remnants of the fire-damaged structure, their voices carrying on the breeze. She watched as they unloaded materials from trucks, the rhythmic clanging of tools echoing through the air. The scene felt like a promise, a fresh start rising from the ashes of the past. That evening, Mr. Roberts came to visit, a broad smile on his face, as he joined Layla and her family on their porch. He brought with him a stack of papers, plans, and sketches for the community center he was building on the site of his old home. As they gathered around the dining table, he laid out the blueprints, showing them the rooms and facilities he envisioned. A study hall, a computer lab, a small library, and a recreational area where kids from the neighborhood could play and learn. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened, Layla," Mr. Roberts said, his voice carrying a note of quiet determination. "And I realized that I want to do more for this community. I've lived here for years, and I've seen how hard people work just to get by. I want to create a space where kids like you, kids with dreams, can have the resources they need to succeed." Layla stared at the blueprints, a lump forming in her throat as she traced the lines of the plans with her fingertips. It was hard to believe that this place would soon be a reality, a place where kids could study, explore, and imagine futures that stretched far beyond the limits of their neighborhood.
Mr. Roberts, this is incredible,
she said, her voice barely above a whisper.
"I can't believe you're doing this."
Mr. Roberts smiled warmly, his eyes crinkling at the corners.
I couldn't have done it without you, Layla. You inspired me. That night, when you ran into that burning house without a second thought, you reminded me of the importance of giving back.
Of using what we have to lift others up. This center is as much your doing as it is mine. Layla felt tears prick at her eyes, her chest swelling with a sense of pride she had never felt before. She thought of all the kids in the neighborhood, kids like Jaden and Mia, who would benefit from this center, who would find a safe space to learn and grow. She thought of how much this place would mean to families who struggled like hers had, and how it could be a beacon of hope in a community that had so often been overlooked. In the weeks that followed, Layla became involved in the planning and preparation for the community center, spending her afternoons meeting with Mr. Roberts and local organizers. She helped organize book drives, reached out to teachers for tutoring volunteers, and even convinced a few of her classmates to donate their time to help with the construction. The work was challenging, but it gave her a sense of purpose that went beyond her own dreams. She was helping to build something that would make a lasting impact on the place she called home. On weekends, she visited the construction site, watching as the building began to take shape, the foundation giving way to walls, then to rooms filled with light. The once empty lot buzzed with activity, the sounds of hammers and drills mixing with the laughter of volunteers. Layla felt a sense of pride every time she walked through the doors of the partially finished building, imagining all the kids who would one day walk these halls. As the center neared completion, Mr. Roberts hosted a small gathering for the volunteers who had helped make it possible. Layla stood beside him on the newly finished steps of the community center, looking out at the faces of her neighbors, many of whom she had known her entire life. She saw Mrs. Thompson standing with her grandchildren, beaming with pride. She saw her own mother, holding Jaden and Mia close, their faces bright with excitement. Mr. Roberts stepped forward, clearing his throat before addressing the crowd.
This center is just the beginning.
He said, his voice strong and clear.
It's a place where our children can dream, where they can find the support they need to reach their full potential. And it's a testament to what we can accomplish when we come together as a community.
He turned to Layla, a proud smile lighting up his face. And none of this would have been possible without Layla. Her courage and selflessness reminded me of the power of giving back, of how one act of kindness can change everything. She's shown us that heroes don't always wear capes. They're the ones who step up when it matters most. Layla felt a wave of emotion crash over her as the crowd erupted into applause. She glanced down at her feet, a blush creeping up her cheeks, but she couldn't help the small smile that tugged at her lips. It was strange, being seen as a hero when she had only done what felt right. But as she looked out at the faces of her neighbors, she realized that this moment wasn't just about her. It was about all of them, about the hope they were building together. After the applause died down, Layla took a deep breath and stepped forward.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts, and thank you to everyone who's helped make this center a reality.
She said, her voice shaking slightly, but growing stronger with each word.
This place is for all of us. It's a chance to show what our community can do, and I promise I'll keep working hard to make sure we live up to that promise.
She paused, glancing back at the community center behind her, its freshly painted walls gleaming in the afternoon sun.
This is just the beginning,
she said, her eyes shining with determination.
And I can't wait to see what we'll do next.
As the gathering turned into a celebration, Layla felt a warmth bloom in her chest, filling the spaces where doubt and uncertainty had once lingered. She had found a new purpose, one that went beyond her own dreams and goals. She had the chance to give back, to help others find their way, just as she had been helped. And as she stood there, surrounded by the laughter and hope of her community, Layla felt a certainty settle deep within her. Whatever the future held, she knew that she was ready for it, because she wasn't just building a new path for herself. She was building it for everyone who believed that no matter how small the act, kindness had the power to change everything. As the months passed, the Roberts Community Center officially opened its doors to the neighborhood, and Layla found herself stepping into a new role, one that demanded leadership, empathy, and a drive to make a real difference. It was a position she had never imagined for herself, but it felt right, like a calling she had been waiting to answer. Every afternoon after school, Layla would make her way to the community center, where she had taken on the responsibility of organizing study groups and tutoring sessions. The study hall buzzed with energy, filled with kids of all ages eager to learn and grow. Layla moved between tables, offering guidance on everything from math problems to writing assignments, her voice calm and encouraging as she helped students who reminded her of herself. Not so long ago, she had been the one struggling over textbooks, trying to hold on to hope for a future beyond what she could see. At first, she worried about whether the kids would listen to her, whether they would respect her as a leader. But it didn't take long for those fears to fade. The younger children looked up to her with wide-eyed admiration, eager to follow her instructions and soak up every bit of knowledge she offered. The older kids, the ones closer to her age, appreciated the way she treated them as equals, never talking down to them or making them feel small. Layla discovered a confidence she hadn't known she possessed, a voice that commanded respect through patience and understanding. She became a mentor, a role model, and a trusted figure in the center. And with each day that passed, she saw the impact of her work in the faces of the kids around her. There was Malik, a shy 7th grader who struggled with reading but came alive whenever they discussed science. And Jasmine, a bright but restless girl who found new focus when Layla encouraged her to explore her love for art. Layla's favorite part of the day was when she led the weekly leadership workshops, where she encouraged the older kids to think about their futures, to dream big and make plans. She taught them how to set goals, how to believe in their potential even when the world tried to tell them otherwise. As she spoke to them, she saw echoes of her own journey, the doubt, the hope, the determination to reach for something better. One evening, as she wrapped up a study session, Layla noticed a familiar face in the doorway. Mr. Roberts, watching from the shadows with a proud smile on his face. He had become a frequent visitor to the center, always eager to see the progress being made and to offer advice or a helping hand where he could. As the last of the students filtered out, he approached Layla, his footsteps echoing softly in the quiet room. "You've done a remarkable job here, Layla," he said, his voice warm with admiration. "I've watched you grow into a leader, someone who's not just focused on her own success, but on lifting up those around her. I couldn't be prouder." Layla smiled, feeling a familiar warmth spread through her chest. She had come to value Mr. Roberts' opinion deeply, seeing him not just as a benefactor, but as a mentor and friend. "Thank you, Mr. Roberts," she replied, her voice sincere. "But I couldn't have done any of this without your help. You've given me and so many others a chance we never thought we'd have." Mr. Roberts chuckled softly, shaking his head.
All I did was open a door. You're the one who's been walking through it, showing others the way.
"And I have a feeling you're going to keep opening doors for a lot more people in the future." They stood together in the quiet study hall, looking out at the rows of desks and bookshelves filled with donated materials. Layla thought about the countless hours she had spent here, about the faces of the kids she had come to know so well. She thought about how much she had learned, about leadership, about herself, and about the power of believing in others. As the sun dipped below the horizon outside the large windows, casting long shadows across the room, Layla found herself reflecting on how far she had come. She remembered the uncertainty she had felt when Mr. Roberts first made his offer, the fear that she wasn't good enough, that she would somehow fail to live up to the expectations placed on her. But now, she saw herself in a new light, not as someone defined by her doubts, but as someone who had faced those doubts head-on and come out stronger on the other side. Mr. Roberts seemed to sense the direction of her thoughts. He laid a hand on her shoulder, his touch gentle and reassuring. "It's a rare thing, Layla," he said softly, "to find someone who can lead with both their heart and their mind. You have that gift. Don't ever forget it." Layla nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat.
I won't,
She promised, her voice thick with emotion.
and I'll keep doing my best to make a difference here for as long as I can.
As the months passed, the community center became a hub of activity, drawing kids from all corners of the neighborhood. Its once bare walls were now covered with colorful murals, the result of a project Layla had organized to give the kids a chance to express their creativity. The rooms buzzed with the sound of laughter and learning, a testament to the progress they had made together. Layla's own life continued to change as well. With Mr. Roberts' support, she was able to attend college open houses and meet with admissions counselors who had never seemed accessible before. She worked tirelessly on her scholarship applications, crafting essays that told the story of her journey, of the fire, of the community center, of her dreams of becoming a doctor. When acceptance letters began to arrive in the spring, Layla found herself facing yet another new reality. She had choices. For the first time, she could decide where she wanted to go, what kind of future she wanted to build. It was both exhilarating and terrifying, but she faced it with the same determination that had carried her through everything else. One crisp spring afternoon, as Layla walked through the bustling halls of the community center, she spotted a young girl struggling to carry a stack of books nearly as tall as she was. The sight made Layla smile. She had seen so many moments like this over the past months, moments that reminded her of her own beginnings. She hurried over to help, taking half the books from the girl's arms and guiding her to the study area.
Thank you, Miss Layla.
The girl chirped, her voice bright with gratitude. Layla couldn't help but smile at the title, a reminder of how far she had come.
You're welcome, sweetie.
She replied, ruffling the girl's hair gently.
Now let's get you set up so you can finish that project, okay?
As she watched the girl settle into her work, Layla felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a knowledge that the community center, the scholarships, and the trust fund were just the beginning of something much larger. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the lives she could touch, the people she could inspire to believe in themselves and in each other. That evening, as she closed up the center and turned off the lights, Layla paused at the front door, looking out at the neighborhood that had shaped her. The cracked sidewalks and aging houses seemed different now, full of potential, full of life. She knew that there were still challenges ahead, still struggles that couldn't be ignored, but she also knew that she had found a purpose here, a reason to keep fighting, to keep giving back. And as she stepped out into the cool night air, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. Layla had come a long way from the girl who had rushed into a burning house without a second thought, but the heart that had driven her then was still the same. She knew now that heroism wasn't about grand gestures. It was about showing up day after day for the people who needed you most. She took a deep breath, letting the sounds of the neighborhood wash over her, the distant hum of traffic, the murmur of voices, the laughter of children playing in the street. She thought of Mr. Roberts, of her family, of all the kids who had found a new sense of hope within these walls. And she knew that whatever the future held, she was ready for it, because she had learned that sometimes the greatest acts of bravery aren't about saving a life, but about changing one. Months passed, and the Roberts Community Center flourished as a beacon of hope and opportunity in the neighborhood. Layla's life had become a whirlwind of studying for her college entrance exams, managing tutoring sessions, and helping organize new programs at the center. Yet, amidst the busyness, she often found moments to reflect on how far she had come, how a single night of courage had transformed not just her own future, but the futures of many around her. One warm afternoon, Layla finished leading a study group and decided to take a walk through the neighborhood, her feet carrying her down the familiar streets that had been her home for so long. As she walked, she noticed little changes that had taken root since the community center opened. More kids playing outside, the sound of laughter and conversation filling the air, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. She turned a corner and saw a young girl struggling with grocery bags, helping an elderly woman who lived a few houses down. The sight made Layla stop in her tracks, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. It transported her back to her own childhood, to the small acts of kindness that had defined her days, helping Mr. Roberts with his groceries, offering a hand whenever someone needed it. In that moment, she realized just how much things had changed, how the ripples of her choices had spread through the community in ways she hadn't even noticed. The young girl caught sight of Layla and beamed, waving cheerfully. "Hi, Miss Layla," she called out, her voice carrying across the street. "Look, I'm helping Mrs. Brown with her groceries, just like you helped Mr. Roberts." Layla felt a lump rise in her throat as she waved back.
That's wonderful. Keep up the good work.
She called, her voice bright and encouraging. As she watched the girl continue on her way, she felt a sense of pride swell within her, a recognition that she had become a part of something larger than herself, that her actions had inspired others to step up and make a difference. The scene stayed with her as she made her way back to the community center, the air warm against her skin. When she arrived, she found Mr. Roberts waiting for her by the community garden that had been planted on the lot where his house once stood. The garden was thriving now, filled with flowers and vegetables that the kids from the center had helped to plant. It was a living testament to the resilience and growth that had come from the ashes of the past. Mr. Roberts looked up as she approached, a fond smile spreading across his face. "Taking a walk down memory lane?" he asked, his voice gentle. Layla nodded, joining him by the edge of the garden, where bright sunflowers stretched toward the sky.
I saw a little girl helping Mrs. Brown with her groceries.
Layla said, her voice soft with wonder.
It reminded me of when I used to help you back before any of this happened. It's strange, isn't it? How things come full circle.
Mr. Roberts nodded thoughtfully, his gaze sweeping over the garden and the community center beyond.
You've started something special here, Layla. It's like planting seeds. Sometimes you don't realize how far the roots will spread until you see what grows from them.
They stood in companionable silence for a moment, listening to the hum of voices from inside the center, the laughter of children playing in the courtyard. Layla thought about the countless lives that had touched hers. Her mother, who had worked tirelessly to give her family a chance. Her siblings, who had always looked up to her with bright, trusting eyes. And Mr. Roberts, who had believed in her when she doubted herself most.
I used to think that success meant leaving this place behind.
Layla admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper.
I thought that if I could just get to college, get a good job, then I'd have made it. But now I see that success isn't about leaving. It's about finding a way to give back to make sure that others have a chance too.
Mr. Roberts placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch steady and reassuring.
That's a lesson that takes some of us a lifetime to learn, Layla,
he said, pride coloring his words.
But you figured it out early, and because of that, you're going to go further than any of us ever imagined.
Layla turned to him, meeting his gaze with a determination that burned brightly in her eyes.
I just want to make sure I don't forget where I came from, no matter how far I go,
she said, her voice steady. This community, these people, they're a part of me, and I want to keep making a difference here, no matter what happens. Mr. Roberts smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners.
I know you will, Layla. You've already changed so much just by being yourself.
The days flew by, and soon enough, Layla found herself preparing for her next big step, heading off to college. Her acceptance letter from a prestigious university had arrived in the mail, and though she was thrilled, she couldn't shake the bittersweet feeling that came with leaving behind the place that had shaped her. She spent her final weeks at the community center, organizing a series of workshops and passing on her responsibilities to the next generation of leaders she had helped to cultivate. The morning of her departure arrived too soon, and as she stood outside her house, bags packed and ready, she looked out at the neighborhood one last time. Her mother wrapped her in a tight hug, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you, Layla," she whispered, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You've come so far, and I know you're going to keep doing amazing things." Layla held onto her mother a moment longer, feeling the strength of her love wrap around her like a shield. Then she pulled back, blinking away the tears that threatened to spill over, and turned to find Mr. Roberts waiting by the car, his expression warm and encouraging.
Ready for the next chapter?
He asked, raising an eyebrow as he opened the car door for her. Layla smiled, a small, brave smile that held a world of hope and uncertainty.
Yeah, I think I am.
She replied, her voice steady. She glanced back at the community center, at the familiar streets that had been her home for so long, and felt a rush of gratitude for everything they had given her.